Some sounds can break your heart in an instant. And for Jakob Stoltzfus, it was the trembling voice of a lost child calling for her mother. Every parent knows that gut-wrenching fear of losing sight of their little one, even for just a moment. Jakob was a 58-year-old Amish widower who had spent 3 years avoiding the outside world after losing his wife. His days were simple morning chores, tending his farm, and evening prayers in the quiet Pennsylvania countryside. He hadn't spoken to anyone from the English world in years, especially not since his daughter left their community behind. But on this October morning, everything changed when he found a 6-year-old girl with tangled blonde hair standing at the edge of his cornfield. Her English accent was unmistakable, and her frightened whisper would haunt him. "Can you help me find my mommy?" She fell down. What Jakob didn't know was that helping this lost child would force him to confront his own painful past and uncover a connection he never saw coming. But why was this little English girl alone in Amish country, and what really happened to her? Mother, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun like every other for Jakob Stoltzfus, with the familiar rhythm that had sustained him through 3 years of widowhood. He'd risen before dawn, as was his custom, pulled on his work clothes with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed the same motions for decades, and stepped into the crisp October air that carried the scent of ripening corn and wood, smoke from distant chimneys. His boots crunched softly on the frost-touched grass as he made his way to the barn, where his 2 draft horses, Moses and Aaron, waited with patient eyes and gentle snorts of greeting. The animals had been Sarah's idea. She'd always insisted that horses should have proper biblical names, not the casual monikers that some of the younger families had taken to using. Even now, 3 years after her passing, Jakob could hear her voice in the morning stillness. "They're God's creatures, Jakob. They deserve names that honored their purpose." The memory brought both comfort and pain, as all thoughts of Sarah did. He'd learned to carry both emotions together, like water in cupped hands, precious but impossible to hold without loss. As he measured out oats for the horses, Jakob caught sight of the thin gold band that still circled his left ring finger. Sarah's wedding ring. He'd never been able to remove it, though the community elders had gently suggested it might be time. The ring had become part of him, a physical reminder of promises kept and love that death couldn't diminish. The farm itself bore witness to their shared life. Every fence post, every carefully tended garden row, every stone in the pathway leading to their modest white farmhouse had been placed with Sarah's input and blessing. She'd had an eye for beauty that complemented his practical nature. Where he saw only function, she'd seen possibility. The rose bushes climbing the front porch, now heavy with late-season blooms, had been her particular pride. Even the placement of the kitchen window, positioned just so to catch the morning light while she prepared breakfast, spoke of her gentle influence on their shared world. But it was a world that had grown smaller since her death. Jakob's interactions with the community had dwindled to the essential Sunday services, necessary business dealings, and the occasional helping hand when a neighbor needed assistance with a barn raising or harvest. He no longer lingered after church services for the social conversations that had once been a source of joy. The well-meaning questions about his health, his loneliness, his future plans had become too much to bear. Better to return home quickly, to the silence that made no demands and offered no false comfort. His daughter, Rebecca's departure, had only deepened his isolation. She'd left the Amish life 2 years after her mother's death, drawn to what she called the wider world, with an intensity that both frustrated and frightened Jakob. Their final conversation still echoed in his memory. Rebecca standing in this very kitchen, her prayer cap removed, and her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, speaking of opportunities in education and a life beyond the boundaries of their faith community. "I need to find my own way, Papa," she'd said. her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mama always said I had a restless spirit. Maybe it's time I learned what that means." Jakob had tried to understand, had prayed for wisdom and patience, but the words that came from his mouth had been hard and unforgiving. Words about duty and tradition and the dangers of the English world. Words that had sent his only child walking out the door with a suitcase and a determination he recognized as Sarah's own stubborn strength turned against everything he held dear. The letters had come regularly at first. Cheerful updates about her job in Philadelphia, her small apartment, her new friends. But gradually, they'd grown less frequent, and Jakob's responses had been equally sparse. What was there to say across such a chasm of difference? He'd hoped she might return, especially during the difficult weeks following the first anniversary of Sarah's death. But the months had stretched into years, and hope had faded into resignation. Now his days followed a pattern that seemed carved in stone. Morning chores, breakfast eaten in solitude while reading from the warm Bible that had belonged to his father. Then the work of maintaining a farm that had once supported a family, but now served mainly to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. The corn would be ready for harvest soon, and he'd need to arrange for help with the cutting and husking, a task that would require him to venture beyond his comfortable isolation and coordinate with neighbors whose easy camaraderie only emphasized his own withdrawn state. The house itself seemed to hold its breath in the silence. Sarah's sewing room remained exactly as she'd left it, her quilting frame still holding the wedding ring pattern she'd been working on for their niece's marriage that had taken place 2 years ago, the quilt still unfinished. Jakob passed the room each morning and evening, but he hadn't crossed its threshold since the day after her funeral. Some spaces were too sacred for a grief-clumsy widower to disturb, but this particular morning had carried something different. In its crisp air, a sense of expectation that Jakob couldn't name. He'd felt it while feeding the horses, a stirring in his chest that reminded him of the way Sarah used to pause in her work when she sensed approaching weather. "Something's coming," she'd say, though the sky might be perfectly clear. More often than not, she'd been right. That sense of approaching change had followed him as he'd walked the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and noting which posts would need attention before winter. The October landscape spread around him in shades of gold and russet, the maple trees along the lane blazing with color that Sarah had always called God's own celebration. The corn stood tall and ready, the stalks rustling with a sound like whispered conversations, and the morning sun cast long shadows that made familiar places seem touched with mystery. It was while walking the eastern boundary of his land, where his cornfield met the gravel road that connected their community to the larger world beyond, that Jakob first spotted her. At first glance, she seemed almost like an apparition, a small figure in clothes that were clearly not Amish, sitting on the ground beside the fence post that marked his property line. Her blonde hair caught the morning light, tangled and unkempt, in a way that spoke of a night spent outdoors, and her clothes bore the dirt and wrinkles of hard travel. Jakob's steps slowed as he approached, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Children didn't simply appear at the edges of Amish farmland, especially not children whose clothing and bearing marked them as English. His community was insular by design, protected by both geography and custom from the casual intrusions of the outside world. Yet here sat a little girl who looked to be perhaps 6 years old, clutching something in her small fist and staring at his approaching figure with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. "Child?" Jakob called softly, switching from the Pennsylvania Dutch he'd been thinking into the English he hadn't spoken aloud in months. His voice came out rusty from disuse, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Are you hurt?" The little girl scrambled to her feet at the sound of his voice, and Jakob could see that she was indeed very young, probably no older than Rebecca had been when she'd first started helping Sarah in the garden. Her dress was torn at the hem, her knees scraped and dirty, and she clutched what appeared to be a crumpled photograph against her chest. But it was her accent, when she finally spoke, that stopped Jakob's heart cold. "Can you help me find my mommy?" She whispered, her words carrying the unmistakable cadence of British English, cultured and precise despite her obvious distress. She fell down. Jakob felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the careful controls he'd built around his emotions over the past 3 years. This child's voice carried a note of desperate trust that reminded him painfully of Rebecca's childhood faith in his ability to solve any problem, fix any hurt. But it also awakened something he'd thought was permanently buried, the protective instinct that had once made him a devoted father and husband. "Where did she fall, little one?" Jakob asked gently, lowering himself to one knee so that he could meet her eyes at her own level. The movement brought him close enough to see the tear tracks on her dirt-stained cheeks and to notice that her small hands were shaking as she held the photograph. "I don't know," she whispered, her lower lip trembling. "We were walking, and then there were loud noises, and Mommy told me to run and hide. She said to find help, but I've been walking all night, and I can't find anyone who looks safe." Her eyes, he noted, were a startling shade of blue-green, and they held an intelligence that seemed far too mature for her young face. Jakob's mind raced as he tried to process her words. Loud noises, running, a night spent alone in unfamiliar territory. None of it made sense, but the child's distress was real and immediate, and his paternal instincts were overriding his habitual caution about involvement with the English world. "What's your name, child?" he asked, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "Lila," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her free hand. "Lila Catherine Westbrook. My mommy is Dr. Emma Westbrook, and she's very smart and very brave, but she told me to run when the bad men came, and now I can't find her anywhere." The formality of her introduction, complete with titles and full names, spoke of careful upbringing and education, but also of a child trying to impose order on a situation that had spiraled far beyond her understanding. Jakob felt his heart constrict as he recognized the same mixture of grown-up vocabulary and little girl vulnerability that had once characterized his own daughter's speech. "Well, Lila Catherine Westbrook," Jakob said carefully. "My name is Jakob Stoltzfus, and this is my farm. You're safe now, and we're going to figure out how to help you find your mother." Even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of the commitment he was making, not just to help this child, but to step outside the careful boundaries he'd constructed around his grief and engage once again with the complications of the wider world. The photograph in Lila's hand was more damaged than Jakob had initially realized. As she slowly uncurled her small fingers to show him, he could see that it had been folded and refolded many times, the creases worn white against the faded colors. It showed a woman with Lila's same blonde hair and intelligent eyes, both of them smiling at the camera in what appeared to be a park setting. The woman wore professional clothing, a blazer and slacks that spoke of education and purpose, while Lila was dressed in a simple sundress, her hair neatly braided in a way that contrasted sharply with its current tangled state. "This is my mommy," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She always keeps this picture in her purse, but she gave it to me when she told me to run. She said it would help me remember that she loves me, even if we got separated." Jakob studied the photograph more carefully, noting details that might prove useful. The background showed what looked like an urban park, with tall buildings visible in the distance, certainly not anywhere in the rural Pennsylvania community. Dr. Emma Westbrook, if that was indeed the woman in the photo, appeared to be in her early 30s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. "Can you tell me where you and your mother were when this happened?" Jakob asked gently. "Were you visiting someone nearby?" Lila's forehead wrinkled in concentration. We were staying at a hotel, a nice one with a big lobby and flowers everywhere. Mommy said we were here to meet with some important people about her work. She studies things that happened a long time ago, and she said there were some papers here that she needed to see. What kind of papers? Jakob asked, though he wasn't sure a 6-year-old would understand such details. Old ones, Lila said with the matter-of-fact tone children used when explaining things they didn't fully comprehend. She said they were about land and who owned what a very long time ago. She gets excited about old papers. She says they tell stories that people forgot. Jakob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. Land records and historical documents were sensitive subjects in their community, particularly when English researchers became involved. There had been tensions over the years about property boundaries, mineral rights, and the occasional attempts by outsiders to challenge Amish land ownership based on historical technicalities. If Dr. Westbrook had been investigating such matters, she might have unknowingly stumbled into conflicts with deep roots and powerful interests. "Do you remember the name of the hotel?" Jakob asked, though he suspected it was beyond the reach of a young child's memory. "The Grand something," Lila said, then brightened slightly. "Oh, the Grand Colonial." Mommy said it had a funny name because it was trying to sound old and important. Jakob nodded, filing away the information. There were several hotels in the larger towns within driving distance that might fit such a description, though he had little personal knowledge of such establishments. His interactions with the hospitality industry were limited to the occasional wedding celebration at community-approved venues. "Lila," he said carefully, "when you say there were loud noises and bad men, can you tell me more about what happened? I know it's frightening to remember, but it might help us find your mother." The little girl's face crumpled slightly, and Jakob immediately regretted pushing for details. But after a moment, she seemed to gather her courage and began to speak. In a small, steady voice, "We were walking back from dinner. Mommy had met with some men during the day, and she seemed worried about something they told her. She kept checking her phone and looking around like she thought someone might be following." "Yes." Lila paused, wiping her nose again. "Then, when we were almost back to the hotel, a car came up really fast behind us, and men got out. They were shouting at Mommy, saying she needed to come with them and stop asking questions." Jakob's hands clenched. Involuntarily, the picture Lila was painting suggested something far more serious than a simple accident or misunderstanding. "What did your mother do?" he asked. "She told me to run and hide, and she said to find a grown-up who looked safe and ask for help. She said not to trust anyone in a fancy suit or anyone who seemed too eager to help." Lila looked up at Jakob with those startling blue-green eyes. "You don't wear fancy suits, and you seem kind but not too eager. That's why I thought you might be safe." The child's logic was both heartbreaking and astute. Jakob realized that Dr. Westbrook had prepared her daughter for this possibility, which suggested she'd been aware of potential danger. The fact that Lila had been walking all night and had somehow found her way to his remote farm raised more questions about the circumstances of their separation. "You've been very clever and very brave," Jakob told her, meaning every word. "Your mother taught you well. Now, let's see if we can find any more clues about what happened to her." He stood slowly, his knees protesting the unaccustomed movement, and began to examine the area where he'd found Lila more carefully. The ground near the fence showed signs of her small footprints, but there were other marks as well, tire tracks in the soft earth along the road's edge, and what appeared to be items scattered in the tall grass. "Stay close to me," Jakob instructed as he began to search more systematically. Years of farming had taught him to read the landscape for signs of disturbance, and what he found made his stomach tighten with apprehension. About 20 yards from where Lila had been sitting, partially hidden in a clump of elderberry bush, Jakob spotted something that glinted in the morning sunlight. He pushed through the thorny branches, ignoring the scratches on his hands, and retrieved what proved to be a woman's silver locket, tarnished but intact. The chain was broken, as if it had been torn from someone's neck during a struggle. "Lila," he called softly, "can you come look at this? Be careful of the thorns." The little girl approached cautiously, and her eyes widened when she saw the locket. "That's Mommy's. She never takes it off. She said it belonged to her grandmother, and it's very special." Jakob examined the locket more closely. It was well made, probably antique, with delicate engraving around the edges. When he pressed the small clasp, it opened to reveal two tiny photographs, one of a much younger Emma Westbrook holding a baby that was clearly Lila, and another of an elderly woman who shared their distinctive eye color. "This is important evidence," Jakob said, closing the locket carefully and slipping it into his pocket. "It proves your mother was here, and it suggests she didn't leave willingly." The implications were settling over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a case of a lost tourist or a simple family dispute. Dr. Emma Westbrook appeared to have been abducted, possibly in connection with her research, and her 6-year-old daughter had been left to fend for herself in unfamiliar territory. The fact that Lila had managed to find her way to his farm, miles from any main road, suggested either remarkable luck or something more deliberate about her journey. As they continued searching, Jakob found additional evidence that supported Lila's account. Tire marks that looked too fresh to be from regular farm traffic, disturbed vegetation that suggested a struggle, and most troubling of all, what appeared to be drops of blood on the gravel near where the locket had been found. "Mr. Jakob," Lila said suddenly, her voice small and frightened, "are those bad men going to come back for me?" The question struck Jakob like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on gathering evidence and trying to understand what had happened that he hadn't fully considered the ongoing danger to the child. If Dr. Westbrook had been taken because of her research, and if that research posed a threat to powerful interests, then Lila herself might be at risk. "No one is going to hurt you while you're with me," Jakob said firmly, though he wasn't entirely sure how he could guarantee such a promise. "But we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out how to help your mother." As he spoke, Jakob realized that his carefully constructed isolation was about to be shattered completely. Helping Lila would require him to contact authorities, to engage with the English world in ways he'd successfully avoided for years. It would mean explanations to community elders who already worried about his spiritual state, complications with neighbors who valued their separation from outside troubles, and personal exposure to scrutiny he'd worked hard to avoid. But looking at this brave little girl who'd survived a night alone in strange territory and still maintained hope that the adults in her world could fix what had gone wrong, Jakob found that his choice had already been made. Some responsibilities transcended personal comfort, and some moral imperatives couldn't be ignored simply because they were inconvenient. "Come along, Lila," he said, extending his hand to her. "Let's go to my house. You need food and warmth, and I need to make some telephone calls. We're going to find your mother, but first we need to make sure you're properly cared for." As they walked back toward his farmhouse, Lila's small hand trustingly placed in his larger one, Jakob felt the weight of commitment settling around his shoulders. He was no longer just a grieving widower maintaining a solitary existence. He was once again responsible for protecting someone vulnerable, and the fierce protectiveness he'd thought was buried with his wife came flooding back with surprising intensity. The morning sun climbed higher as they approached the white farmhouse that had been his sanctuary for 3 years. By evening, Jakob knew his world would be irrevocably changed. There would be police officers in his kitchen, social workers asking questions about his suitability as a temporary guardian, and community members expressing concern about his involvement in English troubles. But for now, there was just the immediate need to care for a frightened child and the growing certainty that Dr. Emma Westbrook's disappearance was connected to something much larger and more dangerous than a simple research project gone wrong. The interior of Jakob's farmhouse felt almost foreign to him as he guided Lila through the front door, seeing his carefully maintained solitude through the eyes of a young child who'd never encountered Amish life before. The simple furniture, plain walls, an absence of electrical fixtures that had become invisible to him through familiarity suddenly seemed stark and potentially frightening to someone accustomed to the modern world. "It's very quiet," Lila observed, her voice barely above a whisper as she took in the sparsely furnished living room with its handmade chairs and the large Bible that rested open on a wooden stand near the window. "We believe in keeping life simple," Jakob explained, hanging his hat on a peg by the door and noting how small Lila looked in the large space. "But quiet can be peaceful once you get used to it." The kitchen, where he led her next, showed more signs of daily use. Sarah's influence was still evident in the carefully arranged herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the neat rows of preserved vegetables in glass jars along the shelves, and the well-worn wooden table where he'd eaten countless meals in solitary silence. It was here Jakob realized that he would need to begin the delicate process of caring for a child whose needs and expectations were entirely outside his recent experience. "Are you hungry?" he asked, opening the icebox to survey his limited options. His meals had become increasingly sparse and utilitarian since Sarah's death, enough to sustain him, but hardly the kind of nourishing food a growing child required. Lila nodded emphatically, her eyes brightening for the first time since he'd found her. "I haven't eaten since yesterday at dinner. Mommy and I shared a sandwich at the hotel restaurant, and she let me have chocolate cake for dessert because she said it might be a special celebration." The mention of her mother brought a shadow back to her expression, and Jakob felt his heart tighten at the child's brave attempt to maintain normalcy. He busied himself with preparing what he could fresh bread that he'd baked 2 days earlier, butter churned by his neighbor's wife, and jam that Sarah had made from their own strawberries in what would prove to be her final summer dot as Lila ate. With the focused intensity of genuine hunger, Jakob found himself studying her more carefully. She had excellent manners for such a young child, using her napkin properly and saying please and thank you without prompting. Her clothes, despite their disheveled state, were well-made and expensive. Everything about her spoke of careful upbringing and educational privilege, which made her current situation all the more troubling. "Lila," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her with a cup of coffee, "can you tell me more about your mother's work? You said she studies old papers. Do you know what kind of studying she does?" The little girl considered this question while chewing thoughtfully on her bread and jam. "She's a professor," she said finally, "at a university in England. She teaches about history, but not the kind with wars and kings. She likes to find out about regular people who lived long ago and what their lives were like." "And she came here to look at papers about regular people?" "Well," Lila said, frowning slightly, "she said these papers were special because they might prove that some land belongs to different people than everyone thinks. She was excited because she said it could help some families who have been treated unfairly." Jakob's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Land disputes involving historical documentation were exactly the kind of issue that could generate serious conflict in their community, particularly if outside researchers began challenging established property rights or mineral claims. He'd heard whispered conversations after church services about increasing pressure from development companies and the occasional appearance of lawyers asking questions about property boundaries. "Did your mother mention any names of the families she was trying to help, or the people she was meeting with?" Lila shook her head. "She said it was grown-up business and I shouldn't worry about it. But she seemed nervous the whole time we were here, and she kept checking her phone and looking out the window like she thought someone might be watching us. The picture emerging from Lila's innocent observations was increasingly troubling. Dr. Westbrook had clearly been aware of potential danger, had prepared her daughter for the possibility of separation, and had been taken despite her precautions. The professional nature of the abduction, the coordinated approach, the quick departure, the lack of witnesses suggested resources and planning that went far beyond simple intimidation. Jakob rose from the table and moved to the drawer where he kept important papers, pulling out a folder that he rarely opened. Inside were documents that he'd hoped never to need again, contact information for English authorities, legal papers related to Rebecca's departure from the community, and most relevant to his current situation, the business card of a social worker who'd been involved in a community dispute several years earlier. But it was another item in the folder that caught his attention as he searched a letter that Rebecca had written to him 6 months after leaving, filled with her characteristic mix of affection and frustration. As he reread her careful handwriting, Jakob felt a familiar pang of loss and regret. "Papa," the letter began, "I know you think I've abandoned everything you taught me, but that isn't true. I'm using the values you and Mama gave me, the importance of helping others, the need to stand up for what's right, the belief that God calls us to be useful in the world. My work here in Philadelphia is about protecting families like ours from people who would take advantage of them. I wish I could explain it better, but I hope someday you'll understand that leaving the community doesn't mean leaving behind the principles that made our community worth preserving." The letter went on to describe her work with a legal aid organization, a small apartment, her loneliness for home, and her hope that they might eventually bridge the gap between his world and hers. Jakob had read it dozens of times in the months after receiving it, but he'd never found the courage to respond. His silence had been another form of isolation, another wall built against the complications of love and loss. "Mr. Jakob?" Lila's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you sad? You look like Mommy does when she's thinking about my daddy. Your father, is he not with you?" Jakob asked, realizing that Lila had mentioned only her mother in all their conversation. "He died when I was little," Lila said matter-of-factly, though her eyes showed the residual hurt that such losses leave even in young children. "Mommy says he was very brave and helped people, but he got sick and couldn't get better. She says I have his eyes and his stubborn streak." The parallel between Lila's loss and his own struck Jakob with unexpected force. Here was another child learning to navigate the world without one parent, depending entirely on the remaining adult for security and guidance. The thought that Dr. Westbrook might now be lost as well, leaving Lila completely orphaned, was unbearable. "We're going to bring your mother home," Jakob said with more confidence than he felt. "But first, I need to make some telephone calls to people who can help us. Would you like to rest while I do that? You must be very tired." Lila nodded, suddenly looking every bit the exhausted 6-year-old she was. Jakob led her to the small bedroom that had once been Rebecca's, unchanged since his daughter's departure. The single bed was still made with Sarah's careful hospital corners, the walls still bare except for a simple wooden cross that Sarah had carved during Rebecca's childhood illnesses. As he pulled back the quilt, another of Sarah's creations, this one featuring a pattern of interlocking rings that she'd called wedding ring. Jakob felt the weight of time and memory settling around him. This room had once been filled with a child's laughter, whispered bedtime prayers, and the quiet conversations between parent and daughter that had formed the foundation of his most treasured relationships. "This was my daughter's room," he told Lila as she climbed onto the bed, still clutching the photograph of her mother. "She's grown up now and lives far away, but I think she would want you to be comfortable here. What's her name?" Lila asked, settling under the quilt with a sigh of relief. "Rebecca," Jakob said, the name feeling strange on his lips after months of silence. Rebecca Sarah Stoltzfus. That's a pretty name, Lila murmured, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. Do you miss her? The simple question cut straight to the heart of Jakob's carefully maintained composure. Every day, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I miss my daddy every day too, Lila said. But Mommy says that's okay, because missing someone means you love them very much, and love doesn't die, even when people do. Out of the mouths of babes, Jakob thought, as he watched the little girl's breathing slow into the deep rhythm of sleep. In a few simple sentences, this brave child had articulated truths that he'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. Love didn't die. It transformed, evolved, sometimes became a burden. But it never simply disappeared. As he quietly closed the bedroom door and returned to the kitchen to make the difficult telephone calls that lay ahead, Jakob found himself thinking about Rebecca's letter again. Perhaps his daughter's departure hadn't been the abandonment he'd interpreted it as. Perhaps she'd been trying, in her own way, to honor the values he and Sarah had taught her. And perhaps his stubborn silence had been less about principle than about fear of a world that seemed too large and complex for his simple understanding. The telephone in his kitchen felt foreign in his hands as he dialed the number for the county sheriff's office. Speaking to English authorities about matters that touched his community would require him to step outside every boundary he'd carefully constructed around his grief. But as he listened to the phone ring, Jakob thought about the sleeping child in Rebecca's bed and knew that some boundaries were meant to be crossed when love demanded it. The sheriff's deputy who arrived at Jakob's farm 3 hours later was a young man named Officer Martinez, whose careful politeness couldn't quite mask his obvious discomfort with both the unusual situation and the cultural divide he was navigating. Jakob watched from his kitchen window as the patrol car pulled slowly up the dirt lane, noting how Martinez paused before getting out, as if gathering courage for an encounter he wasn't sure how to handle. "Mr. Stoltzfus?" Martinez said when Jakob answered the door, his uniform crisp and his notepad already in hand. "I understand you're caring for a missing child." "Please, come in," Jakob replied, stepping aside to allow the officer entry. "The child is sleeping, but I can show you where I found her and the evidence we discovered." As Jakob related the morning's events, he was struck by how inadequate words seemed to convey the complexity of what had unfolded. Officer Martinez took careful notes, but his questions revealed a focus on procedural requirements rather than the deeper implications of Dr. Westbrook's disappearance. When Jakob mentioned the research into historical land records, Martinez's eyes showed interest but little understanding of the sensitive nature such investigations might have in their community. "We'll need to contact social services about the child's placement," Martinez said, closing his notepad after examining the locket and photographing the disturbed ground where it had been found. "Standard protocol in cases involving unaccompanied minors." "She's not unaccompanied," Jakob said quietly. "She's in my care, and she remains so until her mother is found." "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but there are regulations, officer." "Martinez," Jakob interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made him effective in situations requiring negotiation. "This child has been traumatized by witnessing her mother's abduction. She's found safety with me, and removing her to an institutional setting would only compound her distress. I'm a responsible adult with no criminal record and strong community standing. Surely your regulations allow for emergency fosterage in such circumstances." Martinez looked uncertain, clearly operating outside his usual experience with missing persons cases. "I'll need to consult with my supervisor and with social services. In the meantime, can you provide any additional information about the mother's activities or contacts in the area?" Jakob handed over the hand-drawn map they'd found in Lila's pocket, a child's attempt to record landmarks during her frightening journey through unfamiliar territory. The crude drawing showed a hotel, several roads, what appeared to be a bridge, and various structures that might have been barns or houses. Most intriguingly, it included what looked like a church steeple and several symbols that could have been road signs. Lila drew this while trying to remember her route, Jakob explained. She mentioned staying at the Grand Colonial Hotel, and she remembers walking through farmland for most of the night. Based on the landmarks she's included, I believe she traveled roughly 8 to 10 miles from wherever the initial incident occurred. Martinez studied the map with growing interest. This is actually quite detailed for a child's drawing. She's marked specific buildings and what look like road intersections. If we can identify some of these landmarks, we might be able to narrow down the search area considerably. There's something else, Jakob said, hesitating before continuing. The child mentioned that her mother seemed aware of potential danger, that she prepared Lila for the possibility of separation. This wasn't a random crime. It was planned and executed by people who knew Dr. Westbrook's movements and purpose for being here. The implications seemed to register with Martinez, who made additional notes and asked several more questions about timing, descriptions of vehicles, and any other details Lila might have provided. As they talked, Jakob found himself impressed by the young officer's thoroughness once he moved beyond procedural concerns to focus on the actual investigation. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Martinez said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. A missing person case involving potential abduction gets full departmental resources. But I also want to be honest with you. If this is connected to larger issues involving land disputes or development interests, we may be dealing with people who have significant resources and legal connections." The warning was diplomatically phrased, but Jakob understood its implications. Rural law enforcement, however dedicated, might be outmatched by adversaries with financial resources and political influence. The kind of people who could coordinate a professional abduction and disappearance likely had the means to complicate any official investigation. After Martinez departed with promises to return with additional personnel to conduct a more thorough search of the area, Jakob found himself facing the more immediate challenge of explaining the situation to his community. Word traveled quickly in Amish society, and by afternoon, he could see the telltale signs of approaching visitors, buggies moving along the distant roads with purpose rather than routine, and the gathering of neighbors near the Yoder farm that adjoined his property. The first to arrive was Bishop Lapp, whose weathered face showed concern mixed with the careful neutrality that characterized his approach to complex situations. Jakob had known Samuel Lapp for 30 years, had respected his wisdom and judgment, even when they disagreed on matters of community policy. But he also knew that the bishop's primary responsibility was to the welfare and unity of their church district, which might not align with Jakob's commitment to helping an English child. "Jakob," Bishop Lapp said as he stepped down from his buggy, his greeting carrying the weight of authority tempered by genuine pastoral concern. "I've heard troubling reports about English police visiting your farm. Perhaps you could help me understand what's transpiring." As Jakob explained the morning's events for the second time, he watched the bishop's expression shift from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. The implications were clearly not lost on Samuel Lapp's involvement with English authorities, potential legal complications, and the disruption of community peace that invariably accompanied such entanglements. "You understand," the bishop said carefully, "that taking responsibility for an English child places you in a position of considerable complexity. There are legal implications, cultural considerations, and the matter of what's best for the child herself." "What's best for the child," Jakob replied, "is finding her mother and ensuring her safety until that happens. She's frightened, traumatized, and alone in the world, except for the help I can provide. How could I do less?" But Jakob, consider the broader implications. If this situation involves the kind of conflicts you suspect, your involvement could bring unwanted attention to our entire community. We've worked hard to maintain our separation from such complications." The conversation that followed was one Jakob had anticipated but dreaded. Bishop Lapp's concerns were legitimate from the perspective of community welfare. Their religious principles emphasize mutual aid and care for those in need. But they also valued peace, separation from worldly conflicts, and the protection of their traditional way of life. Harboring an English child involved in what appeared to be a criminal matter could potentially expose the entire community to scrutiny and legal complications they were ill-equipped to handle. "Samuel," Jakob said finally, "I understand your concerns, and I respect your responsibility to our community. But I also believe that our faith calls us to care for the vulnerable, regardless of their background or the complications that care might bring. This child didn't choose to be thrust into our world, but she's here, and she needs help that only we can provide right now." The bishop's response was measured but firm. "I'm not asking you to abandon the child, Jakob, but I am asking you to consider whether your current approach is truly in her best interest, or whether it serves some need of your own that has little to do with her welfare." The question stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Jakob couldn't deny that caring for Lila had awakened feelings and purposes that had been dormant since Sarah's death and Rebecca's departure. The familiar routines of nurturing and protection felt both natural and healing after years of empty solitude. But he also genuinely believed that removing Lila from his care would traumatize her further and potentially place her in danger. If the people responsible for her mother's disappearance decided she posed a threat as evening approached and Bishop Lapp departed with promises to pray for wisdom and guidance, Jakob found himself sitting on his front porch, watching the sun set over the cornfields where his day had begun so differently. Lila had awakened from her nap, refreshed but anxious, asking repeatedly about her mother and when they might hear news of the search. "Mr. Jakob," she said, settling beside him on the porch steps with the natural ease of a child who'd decided to trust him, "do you think my mommy is scared wherever she is?" The question struck him as profoundly insightful for such a young child. "I think your mother is probably very worried about you," he said honestly. "But I also think she's strong and brave, like you are, and she's doing everything she can to find her way back to you." "She taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Lila said, swinging her legs from the step. "It means you do what you need to do even when you are scared." "Are you being brave right now?" Jakob considered the question seriously, recognizing the wisdom in her simple observation. "Yes," he said finally. "I think we're both being brave right now, even though we're both scared about what might happen next." As darkness settled over the farm and they moved inside for a simple dinner, Jakob realized that his carefully constructed isolation was crumbling with remarkable speed. In less than 24 hours, he'd committed himself to protecting a child whose needs would require him to navigate systems and relationships he'd avoided for years. But perhaps, he thought as he watched Lila color pictures at his kitchen table with crayons Officer Martinez had thoughtfully provided, some isolation was meant to be temporary, a season of healing rather than permanent way of life. The challenge now would be maintaining his resolve in the face of community pressure, bureaucratic complications, and the growing certainty that Dr. Westbrook's disappearance was connected to forces far more dangerous than he'd initially understood. The second day brought Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s whose confident bearing and patient demeanor immediately distinguished her from the young officer who'd taken the initial report. She arrived at Jakob's farm in an unmarked sedan, accompanied by a social worker whose presence Jakob had been dreading but knew was inevitable. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Detective Santos said as she introduced herself, "I've reviewed Officer Martinez's report, and I want you to know we're treating Dr. Westbrook's disappearance as a high-priority case. But I also need to discuss Layla's immediate needs and long-term placement." The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Chun, carried herself with the weary professionalism of someone who'd seen too many difficult situations involving children. Her gentle approach with Lila was clearly practiced, but Jakob detected an underlying assumption that temporary placement with an Amish widower was neither appropriate nor sustainable. "Lila appears to be well cared for," Mrs. Chan acknowledged, after spending an hour observing the child's interactions with Jakob and assessing the farm environment. "But there are cultural considerations and legal requirements that make this arrangement problematic for anything beyond emergency care." "What cultural considerations?" Jakob asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Well, the absence of modern amenities, the language differences, the educational gaps," Mrs. Chen replied, her tone diplomatic but firm. "Lila is accustomed to a very different lifestyle, and prolonged exposure to such different expectations could be confusing for her." Jakob felt a familiar frustration rising, the assumption that Amish life was somehow deficient rather than simply different, that their values and practices were obstacles to be overcome rather than valid alternatives to mainstream culture. But before he could respond, Lila herself intervened with the directness that children often bring to adult complications. "I like it here," she announced from her position at the kitchen table, where she'd been drawing pictures of the farm with the crayons Detective Stoltzfus had brought as a follow-up to Martinez's thoughtful gesture. "Mr. Jakob makes good food, and he listens when I talk about Mommy. He doesn't try to make me stop being sad or pretend everything is okay when it isn't." The simple statement carried enough truth to give both women pause. Mrs. Chen's expression softened as she looked at the drawings. Lila had created detailed sketches that showed not just the farm buildings and animals, but Jakob himself, always depicted with a gentle smile and usually shown listening attentively to a small blonde figure. "Lila," Detective Santos said, settling into the chair across from the child, "can you tell us more about the day your mother disappeared? I know it's hard to remember, but even small details might help us find her." What followed was the most detailed account Lila had yet provided, delivered with the matter-of-fact precision that Jakob was beginning to recognize as one of her most remarkable qualities. She described the hotel where they'd stayed, the restaurant where they'd eaten dinner, and most importantly, the conversation she'd overheard between her mother and someone on the telephone. "Mommy was worried," Lila said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She kept saying that the papers she'd found were more important than anyone realized, and that people needed to know the truth before it was too late. She said something about families being cheated and land being stolen, but that the proof was right there in black and white if anyone would just look." Detective Santos and Jakob exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of this information. If Dr. Westbrook had discovered evidence of historical fraud or conspiracy involving land ownership, particularly in an area where development pressures were increasing, she might have inadvertently threatened powerful financial interests. "Did your mother mention any names?" Detective Santos asked gently. "Of people she was working with or people she was worried about?" Lila shook her head. She used initials mostly. She said Dr. was being very helpful, and that Jacob had provided important documents. But she was scared of someone called the Consortium, and she said they had people everywhere who would try to stop her if they knew what she'd found. Reference to a consortium was particularly troubling, suggesting an organized group with significant resources rather than individual actors. Jakob found himself thinking about the increasing development pressure their community had faced in recent years, the offers to purchase farmland at prices well above market value, and the persistent rumors about mineral rights and natural gas, deposits that could be extremely valuable to the right. Interest out after Detective Santos and Mrs. Chun departed with promises to investigate the hotel records and contact the university where Dr. Westbrook worked. Jakob found himself alone with Lila and the weight of growing complexity. The child's revelations had confirmed his suspicions that this was far more than a simple criminal matter. It appeared to be connected to systematic fraud involving land ownership, possibly stretching back generations. That evening, as Jakob sat reading from Sarah's worn prayer book while Lila colored quietly nearby, he found himself drawn to passages about wisdom and courage that he previously encountered only as abstract concepts. Sarah had been particularly fond of the Psalms and had marked dozens of verses about seeking guidance in times of trouble and finding strength to do what was right even when the path was unclear. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee," he read silently. From Isaiah, remembering how Sarah had recited this verse during Rebecca's childhood, illnesses, and his own moments of doubt about farming decisions or community responsibilities. "Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." The words felt different now than they had during his years of grieving solitude. Then they had seemed like empty comfort, promises that felt hollow in the face of loss and abandonment. But caring for Lila had awakened something in him that responded to the call for righteous action, for standing up against injustice even when the personal cost was high. "Mr. Jakob," Lila said suddenly, looking up from her drawing, "why do some grown-ups want to hurt other grown-ups?" Mommy always said that most people are good, but the men who took her seemed very angry and mean. The question touched on complexities that Jakob wasn't sure how to explain to a 6-year-old, particularly when his own understanding of the situation was still evolving. But he recognized that Lila deserved honesty rather than false reassurance. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people become so worried about protecting things they think belong to them that they forget about treating others fairly. And sometimes people want something so badly that they're willing to do wrong things to get it." "Like when children fight over toys?" Lila asked. "Similar, but much more serious," Jakob replied. "When grown-ups fight over important things like land or money, they sometimes forget that other people have feelings and rights too. Your mother was trying to help make sure that didn't happen, and some people didn't like that." Lila considered this explanation with the gravity she brought to most adult topics. So she was like a superhero, but instead of fighting monsters, she was fighting unfairness? The analogy was remarkably apt, and Jakob found himself smiling for the first time in days. "Yes, I think that's exactly what she was doing. And sometimes superheroes have to be very brave because the unfairness they're fighting is protected by people who don't want the truth to come out." "Are you being a superhero too?" Lila asked. "By taking care of me and helping look for Mommy?" Jakob paused, struck by the child's innocent ability to reframe complex moral situations in terms of heroism and justice. In her worldview, caring for the vulnerable and seeking truth weren't complicated theological or ethical positions. They were simply what heroes did when confronted with wrongdoing. "I'm trying to do what's right," he said finally. "Sometimes that means being brave even when you're not sure what will happen next." As they prepared for bed, following the simple routine they'd established over the past 2 days, Jakob reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since finding Lila at the edge of his cornfield. The careful isolation he'd constructed around his grief was dissolving, replaced by engagement with complexities he'd successfully avoided for years. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, he found himself energized by the sense of purpose that caring for this brave child had restored to his daily existence. The spiritual crisis that had plagued him since Sarah's death, the questions about God's plan, the meaning of suffering, the purpose of faith in the face of loss, was beginning to resolve itself through action rather than contemplation. Perhaps, he thought as he settled into his own bed for another night of watchful sleep, faith wasn't meant to be a shield against the world's complications, but a foundation for engaging with them courageously. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He was certain. Detective Santos had mentioned plans to expand the search and investigate the hotel where Dr. Westbrook had stayed. Mrs. Chun would return with additional questions about long-term arrangements for Lila's care. And the community pressures that Bishop Lab had alluded to would likely intensify as word spread about the ongoing police investigation. But tonight, listening to the soft breathing of a sleeping child in Rebecca's old room and the familiar sounds of the farm settling around them, Jakob felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The quiet satisfaction of being exactly where God needed him yesterday had been carefully preserved for decades. Jakob's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, recognizing immediately the photograph that accompanied the brief article about a construction accident at a development site 25 miles from his current home. Jakob Stoltzfus, 28, of Lancaster County, was credited with preventing further casualties when a crane collapse threatened additional workers at the Millbrook Commons construction site. The article read, Stoltzfus, who was employed by this project as a consultant on historical building techniques, organized the evacuation of 12 workers from the danger zone before emergency responders arrived. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity, his brief foray into the English world during the early years of his marriage, when Sarah's medical bills had made additional income a necessity. He'd spent 6 months working with a construction company that specialized in historically accurate renovations, applying traditional Amish building knowledge to projects that required authentic period techniques. You never mentioned that you'd worked outside the community, Detective Santos said, her tone carrying professional interest rather than accusation. This kind of experience might be relevant to understanding Dr. Westbrook's research. Jakob set the clipping down carefully, feeling the weight of memories he'd successfully buried for 30 years. It was a difficult time, he said quietly. Sarah was ill, and we needed money for treatments that weren't available through our community resources. I took work where I could find it, but I returned to farming as soon as we were able. The article mentions you as a consultant on historical building techniques. Detective Santos pressed gently. That suggests specialized knowledge about construction methods, property development, and possibly land use patterns. Dr. Westbrook was investigating historical land grants and property rights. There might be more overlap between your backgrounds than either of you realized. The implication was starting to become clear, and Jakob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. If his brief time in the construction industry had given him knowledge relevant to Dr. Westbrook's research, and if that research had threatened powerful interests, then his involvement in caring for Lila might not be the coincidence it appeared to be. Detective Santos, he said slowly, are you suggesting that my finding Lila wasn't accidental? I'm suggesting that we need to consider all possibilities, she replied. Dr. Westbrook's research focused specifically on this region, involving land grants and property rights that could affect current development projects. If she was investigating fraud or irregularities that touched on the construction industry, particularly projects involving historical renovations or preservation requirements, your background might have made you a person of interest to the same people who took her. The conversation was interrupted by Lila's appearance in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the simple nightgown that Sarah had sewn for Rebecca years earlier. The child had adapted to early rising with the pragmatic acceptance that characterized her approach to most changes, but Jakob could see in her eyes the perpetual worry that had become her constant companion. "Did you find my mommy?" she asked directly, her gaze moving between Jakob and Detective Santos, with the hope that she tried to maintain despite repeated disappointments. "Not yet, sweetheart," Detective Santos replied gently, "but we're learning more about why she came here and what she was investigating. That's going to help us find her." As Jakob prepared breakfast for Lila, he found himself thinking about the implications of Detective Santos's theory. If Dr. Westbrook's research had indeed threatened a development consortium with significant financial interests in the region, then the people responsible for her disappearance would likely have conducted thorough research on anyone connected to her work. His own background in construction, combined with his current isolation and vulnerability as a widower, might have made him an ideal target for manipulation. The phone call that came later that morning seemed to confirm his growing fears. The voice on the other end was professionally pleasant, but carried an undertone of subtle threat that Jakob recognized from his brief experience dealing with English business interests. "Mr. Stoltzfus, this is David Richardson from Richardson Development Group. I understand you're currently caring for the daughter of Dr. Emma Westbrook, and I wanted to offer my assistance in resolving this unfortunate situation." Jakob felt his grip tighten on the phone receiver. "I'm not sure what assistance you're referring to, Mr. Richardson." "Well, caring for a traumatized child is a significant responsibility, particularly for someone in your circumstances. I represent certain interests that would be happy to ensure the little girl receives professional care while the authorities continue their search for her mother. We could arrange immediate placement in an excellent facility, with all expenses covered, of course." The offer was presented as generosity, but Jakob heard the underlying message clearly. Someone wanted Lila removed from his care, and they were willing to pay handsomely to make it happen. The timing of the call, coming so soon after Detective Santos's revelation about his construction background, suggested that Richardson Development Group was connected to the forces that had taken Dr. Westbrook. "Mr. Richardson," Jakob said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but Lila is well cared for where she is. She's been through enough disruption already." "I understand your attachment to the child," Richardson replied, his tone becoming slightly less pleasant. "But surely you realize that your current arrangement is temporary at best. The authorities will eventually require more appropriate placement, and the legal complications could become quite burdensome for someone in your position." The veiled threat was unmistakable, and Jakob felt the familiar protective anger that had once made him effective in dangerous situations. "Mr. Richardson, I don't believe we have anything further to discuss. Think carefully about what's best for everyone involved. Mr. Stoltzfus, some problems are easier to solve when all parties are reasonable." The line went dead, leaving Jakob staring at the phone with a growing sense of urgency. The call had confirmed his worst fears. Dr. Westbrook's disappearance was indeed connected to powerful interests that viewed both her research and Lila's testimony as threats to be eliminated. And now they were applying pressure to remove the child from his protection, presumably to prevent her from providing information that could damage their interests. When Detective Santos returned that afternoon with additional questions about the hotel records, Jakob immediately told her about Richardson's call. Her reaction was swift and decisive. "We need to consider the possibility that you and Lila are both at risk," she said, her professional calm not quite masking her concern. "If Richardson Development Group is involved in Dr. Westbrook's disappearance, they have resources and connections. That could make your current situation untenable." "What are you suggesting?" Jakob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Protective custody, at least temporarily. We can arrange secure housing for both of you while we investigate the connection between Richardson and the missing person case." Jakob looked toward the living room, where Lila was playing quietly with wooden blocks that had once belonged to Rebecca, and felt his heart constrict at the thought of uprooting her again. The child had begun to show signs of healing over the past few days, sleeping through the night, eating with appetite, and even laughing occasionally at the antics of the barn cats. Moving her to an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by strangers, and institutional security measures seemed likely to undo whatever progress she'd made. "Detective Santos," he said finally, "I understand the risks, but I believe Lila is safer here than she would be in any official facility. She trusts me. She's comfortable with our routines, and she's beginning to process her trauma in a healthy way. More importantly, if Richardson and his associates want her removed from my care, that suggests they see our current arrangement as a threat to their interests. Why would we give them what they want? The detective studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. You realize that if you're right about the level of threat we're dealing with, staying here could put both of you in serious danger. I've been thinking about that, Jakob admitted. And I believe that danger exists regardless of where we are. But here, Lila has stability and support, and I have the advantage of familiar territory and community connections. If Richardson's people try to take her by force, they'll have to deal with neighbors who know me and trust my judgment. What Jakob didn't mention was the growing certainty that his own background had made him a target long before Dr. Westbrook's disappearance. The more he thought about the implications of Detective Santos's discoveries, the more convinced he became that his isolation over the past 3 years had been interpreted as vulnerability by people who saw him as either a useful tool or a potential obstacle to their plans. That evening, as he and Lila sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the cornfields in shades of gold and amber, Jakob found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. His decision to work briefly in the English world, driven by love for Sarah and determination to provide for her medical needs. His withdrawal from community engagement after her death, born of grief, but perhaps interpreted by others as weakness. And now his commitment to protecting a child who had become the unexpected catalyst for his return to purposeful action. Mr. Jakob, Lila said, settling against his side with the natural affection she'd developed over their days together. Do you think the bad men know where we are? The question demonstrated the child's remarkable ability to perceive adult undercurrents without fully understanding their implications. Jakob considered how to answer honestly without frightening her unnecessarily. I think they might know, he said carefully, but I also think we're safer here than we would be anywhere else. This is my home, and I know how to protect the people I care about when they're here. Like you protected the workers when the crane fell down, Lila asked, and Jakob realized that she'd been listening more carefully to his conversation with Detective Santos than he'd assumed. Yes, he said, like that. Sometimes protecting people means knowing when to act quickly, and sometimes it means knowing when to stay put and let others come to you. Are you going to let the bad men come to you? Jakob looked down at this remarkable child, whose direct questions consistently cut through adult complications to reach essential truths. I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep you safe and help find your mother, he said. That might mean letting them come to us, or it might mean going to find them. But either way, we're going to face this together. As darkness settled over the farm and they prepared for another night of uncertain sleep, Jakob felt the weight of his commitment settling around his shoulders like a familiar yoke. He was no longer the isolated widower who had stumbled upon a lost child at the edge of his cornfield. He was a man who had chosen to stand between innocence and those who would exploit it. Regardless of the personal cost, the battle lines were becoming clear, and tomorrow would likely bring new challenges to test his resolve. But tonight, with Lila's trust serving as both burden and blessing, Jakob felt more certain of his purpose than he had since Sarah's death. Some fights were worth the risk, and some responsibilities transcended personal safety. This child's welfare and the truth her mother had died trying to protect were worth defending against whatever forces Richardson Development Group could bring to bear. The business card was wedged between two loose floorboards in the abandoned barn where Detective Santos found the first concrete evidence of Dr. Westbrook's whereabouts. Jakob's hand shook as he read the elegant script. Rebecca Sarah Stoltzfus, Legal Aid Advocate, Philadelphia Community Justice Project. Below her name, in smaller print, was a phone number and the notation specializing in land rights and historical property disputes. Your daughter was working with Dr. Westbrook, Detective Stoltzfus said gently, watching Jakob's face for his reaction. We found this along with evidence that both women were being held here until very recently. Based on the forensic evidence, they were moved sometime yesterday, probably after Richardson's people realized we were getting close. The barn belonged to a property that had been abandoned for years, situated in an isolated valley about 15 miles from Jakob's farm. Local records showed it had been purchased by a subsidiary of Richardson Development Group 18 months earlier, ostensibly for future agricultural use. But the modifications they'd found inside reinforced locks, soundproofing materials, and surveillance equipment told a very different story. Jakob sank onto a bale of hay, the business card trembling in his weathered hands. Rebecca hadn't abandoned her faith or her family's values, as he believed for 2 agonizing years. She'd been working to protect families like their own from the kind of systematic fraud that Dr. Westbrook had uncovered. And now she was missing, too, taken along with the woman whose research had threatened to expose decades of illegal land acquisitions. The timeline suggests your daughter made contact with Dr. Westbrook several months ago. Detective Stoltzfus continued, consulting her. Notes. University records show that Dr. Westbrook reached out to legal aid organizations in this region, looking for local experts who could help her understand contemporary implications of her historical research. Rebecca's specialty in land rights would have made her an obvious contact. She never told me, Jakob whispered, his voice thick with grief and regret. All this time, I thought she'd rejected everything we taught her about helping others and standing up for what's right. But she was doing exactly what Sarah and I raised her to do. She was just doing it in a world I didn't understand. Layla, who had been exploring the barn with the careful curiosity of a child trying to understand adult complications, suddenly appeared at Jakob's side. Mr. Jakob, why are you sad? Did we find more clues about Mommy? Detective Stoltzfus knelt down to Leela's level, her expression gentle but serious. Sweetheart, we did find clues about your mother. And we also discovered that she was working with Mr. Jakob's daughter to help solve some very important problems. But now we need to find both of them. Mr. Jakob has a daughter too, Lila asked, her eyes widening with interest. Is she lost? Like Mommy? The innocent question hit Jakob like a physical blow. Yes, Rebecca was lost, not just physically missing, but lost to him emotionally for 2 years because of his stubborn refusal to understand her choices. His grief over Sarah's death had blinded him to his daughter's needs, and his rigid adherence to traditional expectations had driven away the person who shared his deepest values, even if she expressed them differently. Yes, he said quietly, she's lost like your mommy, but we're going to find both of them. As they drove back to the farm, Detective Stoltzfus filled in more details about the conspiracy that Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook had been investigating. Richardson Development Group, working with several other companies, had been systematically acquiring land throughout central Pennsylvania using fraudulent historical claims. They would research properties with unclear or complex ownership histories, then use fabricated documents and corrupt legal processes to challenge current ownership and acquire valuable land at fraction of its worth. The scheme particularly targeted Amish families and other rural landowners who were less likely to have resources for prolonged legal battles. Detective Stoltzfus explained, your daughter was building a class action case that could have resulted in criminal charges and hundreds of millions in damages. And Dr. Westbrook's research provided the historical evidence to prove the fraud, Jakob said, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. Her academic credentials and expertise in historical land records gave credibility to claims that Richardson's people couldn't easily dismiss. Together, your daughter and Dr. Westbrook had assembled a case that could have destroyed the entire consortium. The implications were staggering. Not only had Rebecca been working to protect their community from exploitation, but she'd been doing so in partnership with a woman whose child was now in Jakob's care. The connections between their families went far deeper than the coincidence of Lila's appearance at his farm. It was likely that Dr. Westbrook had specifically instructed her daughter to seek help from Jakob if something went wrong, knowing that Rebecca trusted him despite their estrangement. That evening, as Jakob prepared dinner while Lila colored pictures at the kitchen table, he found himself thinking about the years of silence between him and Rebecca. How many letters had gone unanswered? How many phone calls had he avoided? How many opportunities for reconciliation had he missed because his pride was stronger than his love? "Mr. Jakob," Lila said suddenly, looking up from her drawing, "do you think your daughter and my mommy are together wherever they are?" "I hope so," Jakob replied, and realized that he meant it completely. The thought of Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook supporting each other through whatever ordeal they were facing brought him a measure of comfort he hadn't expected. Both women were intelligent, resourceful, and committed to justice, if anyone could survive whatever Richardson's people had planned for them. It would be these two. "I drew a picture of all of us," Lila announced, holding up her latest creation. The drawing showed 4 figures holding hands in front of a house that was clearly meant to be Jakob's farm. He recognized himself by the beard and hat, Lila by her blonde hair, and 2 other female figures that must represent Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook. Above them, she'd drawn a bright yellow sun and what appeared to be a rainbow. "It's beautiful," Jakob said, his voice catching slightly. "Is that how you imagine it will be when we find them?" "Yes," Lila said with the confident certainty of childhood faith. "Because families should be together, and we're going to be a family when Mommy and your daughter come home." The simple declaration nearly broke Jakob's heart with its mixture of hope and trust. This child, who had lost her father and now her mother, still believed in the possibility of restored families and happy endings. Her faith shamed his own doubts and strengthened his resolve to make her innocent prophecy come true. That night, after Lila had fallen asleep in Rebecca's old bed, Jakob sat at his kitchen table and did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He wrote a letter to his daughter. But this wasn't the apologetic, tentative correspondence he'd drafted and discarded dozens of times. This was a father's promise to a daughter who had never stopped fighting for the values he taught her. "My dearest Rebecca," he began, "I know now what you've been doing, and I know how wrong I was to misunderstand your calling. You are your mother's daughter in every way that matters, and I am proud beyond words of the woman you've become. Hold on, wherever you are. Lila and I are coming to bring you home." He sealed the letter in an envelope, knowing he might never have the chance to give it to her directly. But writing it felt like a first step toward healing wounds that had festered for too long. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of finding both women and bringing them safely home. Tonight, he allowed himself to hope that it wasn't too late for second chances and restored relationships. The business card sat on the table beside his letter, a tangible reminder that family bonds could survive misunderstanding and separation. Rebecca had never really left him. She'd simply found a different way to honor the principles he and Sarah had taught her. And now, through the innocent faith of a 6-year-old girl who believed in happy endings, he had the chance to prove that love was stronger than pride, and that some mistakes could still be forgiven. The hidden research files that Detective Santos discovered in Jakob's own barn came as the greatest shock of all. Tucked beneath loose floorboards in the feed storage area, wrapped in waterproof materials and carefully concealed, were dozens of documents in Rebecca's precise handwriting, along with photocopies of historical land grants, property deeds, and correspondence that painted a devastating picture of systematic fraud spanning 3 decades. She must have hidden these here. During one of her visits home, Detective Santos said as they examined the materials by lamplight in Jakob's kitchen, "Look at the dates on some of these letters." She was documenting this case for over a year before she made contact with Dr. Westbrook. Jakob felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow as he read through his daughter's meticulous work. Rebecca had identified patterns of fraudulent land acquisition that stretched back to the 1990s, affecting not just Amish families, but dozens of rural communities throughout central Pennsylvania. Her legal analysis was thorough and damning, built on hundreds of hours of research that she'd conducted while maintaining her regular caseload in Philadelphia. "She came home," he said quietly, running his fingers over a handwritten note in Rebecca's familiar script. "All those times I thought she was avoiding us, she was actually coming back to gather evidence and document what was happening to our neighbors." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Richardson Development Group, working with corrupt county officials and a network of lawyers and real estate agents, had systematically targeted properties with complex ownership histories. They would research families who had held land for generations, identify technical flaws in historical transfers or recording processes, then use fabricated documentation to challenge ownership in court. Most families, lacking resources for prolonged legal battles, would settle for far less than their property was worth. Your daughter estimated that over 50,000 acres had been fraudulently acquired. Detective Santis continued, with a total value exceeding $200 million. The criminal conspiracy charges alone could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. Lila, who had been quietly listening while coloring in her notebook, looked up with the serious expression she wore when processing complicated adult information. "So the bad men were stealing land from families like yours?" "Yes, sweetheart," Jakob replied. "And your mother and my daughter were working together to stop them and help the families get their land back." "That's why they took them," Layla said, with the matter-of-fact logic that consistently impressed the adults around her. "Because they didn't want people to know about the stealing." The child's simple summary cut straight to the heart of the matter. Dr. Westbrook's academic research had provided historical credibility to Rebecca's legal case, creating a combination that threatened to expose and destroy a conspiracy that had operated successfully for decades. The stakes were enormous, not just financial, but criminal, with the potential for lengthy prison sentences and the complete collapse of several major development companies. As they continued reviewing the documents, a pattern emerged that made Jakob's blood run cold. Several of the targeted properties belonged to families he knew personally, neighbors who had struggled with legal challenges to their land ownership, friends who had been forced to sell family farms under mysterious circumstances, and community members who had faced financial pressure that had seemed to come from nowhere. "The Yoder farm," he said suddenly, recognizing property descriptions in one of Rebecca's files. "Samuel Yoder lost 40 acres to a development company 3 years ago. He said lawyers came with papers claiming his great-grandfather never properly recorded the deed, and that the land had always belonged to someone else. According to your daughter's research, that was one of Richardson's first major acquisitions in your immediate area," Detective Santis confirmed. "They used fabricated documents to claim the original land grant had been improperly transferred, then offered to buy out the Yoder family's interest for a fraction of the land's actual value." The realization that his own community had been systematically victimized while he maintained his isolated grief brought Jakob a shame deeper than any he'd experienced since Sarah's death. While he'd been withdrawn from community engagement, focused on his personal loss, his neighbors had been fighting battles that he might have helped them understand and resist. "There's something else," Detective Santos said, her voice carrying a new note of urgency. "The latest documents in this collection are dated less than 2 weeks ago. Your daughter was still actively investigating right up until her disappearance, and it looks like she'd identified the location of Richardson's document forging operation. The address she showed Jakob was for a commercial building in a nearby town, listed in Rebecca's notes as the suspected headquarters for the conspiracy's documentation fraud. According to her research, This was where falsified historical records were created and backdated, where legitimate documents were altered, and where the entire paper trail supporting fraudulent land claims was manufactured. "We need to coordinate with the FBI on this," Detective Stoltzfus continued. "The scope of the conspiracy crosses state lines and involves federal wire fraud charges. But more immediately, if your daughter and Dr. Westbrook discovered the location of this operation, that might be why they were taken." As evening approached, Jakob found himself facing a decision that would require him to step further outside his traditional boundaries than he'd ever imagined. Detective Stoltzfus was proposing a coordinated operation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, designed to simultaneously rescue the missing women and gather evidence to prosecute the entire conspiracy. But the plan would require Jakob's active participation, using his knowledge of the community and his daughter's research to help identify key locations and individuals. "I understand this is asking a lot," Detective Stoltzfus said as they prepared to contact federal authorities. "You'd be putting yourself at considerable risk, and there's no guarantee we can ensure your safety or Lila's throughout the operation." Jakob looked at the child, who had transformed his understanding of duty and purpose, now sleeping peacefully in Rebecca's bed, despite the enormous uncertainties surrounding her future. In less than a week, caring for Lila had reconnected him to everything he'd once valued about faith, family, and community service. The thought of abandoning that responsibility now, when both she and Rebecca needed him most, was impossible to contemplate. "Detective Stoltzfus," he said quietly, "3 years ago, I lost my wife and withdrew from everything that gave my life meaning. A week ago, God placed this child in my care and gave me a chance to redeem those wasted years. I won't abandon her now, and I won't abandon Rebecca. Whatever needs to be done, I'm ready to do it." The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight, as they developed plans that would test every skill Jakob had acquired during his brief time in the construction industry, every connection he maintained within the Amish community, and every reserve of courage he'd inherited from generations of ancestors who had faced persecution with quiet determination. The operation would begin at dawn, with coordinated searches of multiple locations based on Rebecca's research and Dr. Westbrook's academic findings. Jakob would accompany the team searching properties in Amish country, where his presence might prevent community resistance and his knowledge of local geography could prove crucial. Other teams would simultaneously target the document forging operation and Richardson Development Group's corporate headquarters. The biggest risk, Detective Stoltzfus warned, is that Richardson's people might decide to eliminate the evidence rather than face prosecution. If they realize we're closing in, they might kill Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook rather than let them testify. Jakob finished grimly. "I understand the stakes, Detective, but the alternative is allowing this conspiracy to continue destroying families while the 2 women who tried to stop it remain prisoners. That's not acceptable." As he prepared for what might be his final night of peaceful sleep, Jakob found himself thinking about the prayer book that had sustained him through Sarah's illness and death. The verses about courage in the face of adversity, about standing up for justice, even when the cost was high, about protecting the innocent and defending the vulnerable all, took on new meaning in the context of tomorrow's challenges. He knelt beside his bed for the first time in months, not to ask for comfort or understanding, but to request strength for the battle ahead. The man who had once organized the evacuation of construction workers from a collapsing crane, who had briefly stepped outside his community's boundaries to provide for his family's needs, was about to face the greatest test of his life. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. He'd be fighting for the daughter who had never stopped honoring his values, and for the child who had restored his faith in the possibility of redemption. The wooden cross that Sarah had carved for Jakob during the early years of their marriage felt warm against his palm as he clutched it in his pocket, drawing strength from its familiar weight while the federal agents prepared for the coordinated assault on Richardson Development Group's operations. Dawn was still an hour away, but the staging area in the abandoned parking lot buzzed with quiet activity as multiple teams reviewed their assignments one final time. "Remember," Agent Walsh, the FBI team leader, said during the final briefing, "we have credible intelligence that both hostages are being held at the primary target location, a warehouse complex owned by Richardson, subsidiaries about 12 miles east of here. But we also know that Richardson's people have been monitoring law enforcement communications, so they may be expecting us." Jakob adjusted the borrowed tactical vest that felt strange and bulky over his plain work clothes, acutely aware that he was the only civilian participating in what could become a dangerous rescue operation. But his knowledge of the area's geography and his daughter's research had proved invaluable in planning the approach routes, and Agent Walsh had insisted that his presence might be crucial if they encountered community resistance or needed to navigate properties with unclear boundaries. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Agent Walsh continued, "you'll be with Team 3, approaching from the agricultural access road on the property's north side. Your job is to help us understand what we're seeing and to identify any community members who might be in the area. If shooting starts, you get down and stay down until we give the all clear." The tactical plan was complex but elegant, designed to prevent Richardson's people from destroying evidence or harming the hostages when they realized the operation was compromised. Team 1 would secure the document forging facility. Team 2 would arrest Richardson and his key associates at their corporate headquarters, and Teams 3 and 4 would simultaneously assault the warehouse where Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook were believed to be held as they loaded into the unmarked vehicles that would transport them to their positions. Jakob found himself thinking about Lila, safely hidden with Bishop Lapp's family until the operation was complete. The child had accepted the temporary separation with remarkable maturity, understanding that the adults in her life were working to bring her mother home. "Bring them back, Mr. Jakob," she'd whispered as he kissed her forehead in goodbye. "Bring Mommy and your daughter back so we can be a family like in my picture." The memory of her innocent faith strengthened his resolve as Team 3 moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward their assigned position. The warehouse complex loomed ahead of them, a collection of modern metal buildings, surrounded by high fencing and security lighting that seemed oddly sophisticated for what was supposed to be agricultural storage. Motion sensors along the perimeter, Agent Martinez whispered into his radio as they approached the outer fence. "Looks like they've got early warning systems in place." Jakob studied the layout carefully, noting details that his construction experience helped him interpret. "Those aren't storage buildings," he said quietly to Agent Walsh. "Look at the ventilation systems and the electrical connections. This is set up more like a manufacturing facility." "Manufacturing what?" Walsh asked. "Documents," Jakob replied grimly. Rebecca's research suggested they had sophisticated equipment for aging paper, reproducing historical printing techniques, and creating documents that could pass expert authentication. This complex is probably where they've been producing fraudulent land grants and property deeds for decades. The realization that they were approaching not just a holding facility, but the heart of the entire conspiracy added urgency to their movements. If Richardson's people realized they were compromised, they might destroy not only the evidence of their crimes, but also the hostages who could testify against them. "Team 1 is in position," crackled through their radio communications. "Team 2 reports target acquired and ready to move. Team 4 has visual on the primary structure." Agent Walsh checked his watch, noting that they were still 15 minutes ahead of their synchronized assault time. But as they moved closer to the warehouse complex, Jakob spotted something that made his blood run cold. "Fresh tire tracks," he said, pointing to deep ruts in the muddy ground near a side entrance. Multiple vehicles, and recent probably within the last few hours. The implications were clear and terrifying. Either Richardson's people were evacuating the facility, or they were bringing in additional resources to deal with what they'd somehow learned was an imminent law enforcement operation. Either scenario suggested that Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook were in immediate danger. "Control, this is Team 3. Agent Walsh spoke rapidly into his radio. "We have evidence of recent vehicle activity at the target location. Request permission to advance timeline. Negative, Team 3. Maintain position until synchronized assault time." But even as the radio crackled with command decisions, Jakob was studying the warehouse complex with growing alarm. Years of construction experience had taught him to read buildings for signs of occupancy and activity, and what he saw suggested that the facility was being systematically emptied. "Agent Walsh," he said urgently, "look at the loading dock doors on the main building. They're open, and there are no lights visible inside. Either the building is empty, or they're moving everything under cover of darkness." The federal agent raised his binoculars and studied the structure for several tense minutes before reaching the same conclusion. "Control, we need to move now. The facility appears to be in active evacuation mode. All teams, advance to assault positions immediately," came the response. "Repeat, all teams advance now." What followed was a carefully choreographed operation that Jakob could only observe with growing anxiety as armed agents moved through the darkness toward buildings that might or might not contain the women they'd come to rescue. The warehouse complex erupted in floodlights as the first team breached the perimeter, and Jakob could hear the distant sounds of doors being forced and commands being shouted. Team 1 has secured the document facility extensive equipment, but no personnel present, came the first report. Team 2 has Richardson and 3 associates in custody at corporate headquarters. Followed quickly, but it was the silence from Team 4, assigned to the building where the hostages were supposedly held, that made Jakob's heart race with fear. Minutes passed without communication, until finally Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with devastating news. Team 4 has cleared the primary holding facility. Evidence of recent occupancy, but no hostages present. Repeat, no. Hostages found. The words hit Jakob like a physical blow. They were too late. Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook had been moved, possibly killed, before the rescue operation could reach them. All of their planning, all of their careful coordination, had failed to save the 2 women whose courage had exposed the conspiracy, but cost them their freedom. "Search all secondary buildings," Agent Walsh commanded, but Jakob could hear the disappointment in his voice. Professional law enforcement operations could be measured successful by the arrests made and evidence gathered. But for Jakob, the only metric that mattered was bringing his daughter and Lila's mother home safely. As dawn broke over the warehouse complex, revealing the full scope of Richardson's document forging operation, but none of the human beings they'd come to rescue, Jakob felt the familiar weight of loss settling over his shoulders. Once again, he'd been too late to protect the people he loved. Once again, his efforts had failed when they mattered most. But as he stood in the growing daylight, clutching Sarah's wooden cross and thinking about the child who was waiting for him to bring her mother home, Jakob realized that this failure was different from the helpless grief he'd experienced during Sarah's illness. This time, he wasn't alone in his loss, and the fight wasn't over. Richardson might have moved Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook, but the evidence they'd gathered would ensure that the conspiracy was exposed and prosecuted. And somewhere, those 2 brave women were still alive, still fighting, still hoping for rescue. The battle wasn't won, but it wasn't lost either. And Jakob Stoltzfus, who had once organized the evacuation of workers from a collapsing construction site, wasn't ready to surrender the field. The wedding ring that Lila's mother had worn, a simple gold band that had somehow survived her captivity, was the first thing Jakob saw when the abandoned grain silo door swung open to reveal two women blinking in the sudden daylight. Dr. Emma Westbrook was thinner than in the photograph Lila had carried, her professional clothing torn and dirty, but her eyes held the same intelligent determination that her daughter had inherited. Beside her, Rebecca looked older than her 28 years, her prayer cap long gone and her dark hair tangled, but she was alive and whole and looking at her father with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "Papa?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe that Jakob Stoltzfus, who had avoided the English world for 3 years, was standing in a tactical vest surrounded by federal agents, holding a radio and coordinating a rescue operation. "Hello, daughter," Jakob said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion he'd held back for too long. "I've come to take you home." The grain silo had been Richardson's final fallback position, an isolated structure on abandoned farmland 20 miles from the warehouse complex. It was Lila's innocent observation that had led them here, her comment that the bad men's cars had sounded crunchy when they drove away, like they were driving on old corn husks. Agent Walsh had realized she might be describing vehicles driving through harvested cornfields, and a systematic search of abandoned agricultural sites had finally led them to this forgotten corner of Richardson's property empire. "Emma," Rebecca said, helping Dr. Westbrook stand on unsteady legs, "this is my father, Jakob. The man I told you about, the one whose values taught me to fight for justice, even when it seemed impossible." Dr. Westbrook's smile was weak, but genuine, as she looked at Jakob with recognition. "Lila's guardian angel," she said. "She described you perfectly kind eyes and gentle hands, but strong enough to protect people who need protecting." "Your daughter is remarkable," Jakob replied, stepping forward to offer support to both women as they emerged from their prison. "She's been very brave, and she never stopped believing we would find you." The reunion that followed was complicated by the immediate need for medical attention and law enforcement debriefing, but Jakob felt his heart healing with each moment he spent in Rebecca's presence. She'd grown into the strong, principled woman he and Sarah had hoped she would become, but she'd done so while honoring the values they taught her rather than rejecting them. "I'm sorry, Papa," Rebecca said as paramedics checked her vital signs and documented evidence of her captivity. "I should have told you what I was doing, should have asked for your help instead of trying to protect you from complications." "No, daughter," Jakob replied firmly. "I'm the one who should apologize. I let my grief blind me to what you were trying to accomplish, and I allowed pride to keep us apart when we should have been working together." Dr. Westbrook, despite her own exhaustion and trauma, watched their conversation with the keen interest of someone who understood family dynamics and their healing power. "She talked about you constantly," she told Jakob, "about the man who taught her that sometimes you have to step outside your comfort zone to do what's right, even when it costs you something precious." The arrest of Richardson and his associates had already made national news, with federal prosecutors announcing charges that could result in decades of prison time and hundreds of millions in restitution to defrauded families. But for Jakob, the only news that mattered was that Rebecca and Dr. Westbrook were safe, that Lila would be reunited with her mother, and that the conspiracy that had threatened their community was finally exposed. As they traveled back toward Jakob's farm in the convoy of federal vehicles, Rebecca shared details of their captivity that revealed both the scope of Richardson's desperation and the courage both women had shown in protecting each other and preserving crucial evidence. "Emma never gave up," Rebecca told her father. "Even when they threatened to hurt Lila if she didn't agree to recant her research, she refused to abandon the families we were trying to help. She said her daughter would rather have a mother who died fighting for justice than one who lived by surrendering to corruption." The reunion between Dr. Westbrook and Lila took place in Jakob's kitchen, the same room where the child had eaten her first meal as his unexpected guest. The joy on both their faces as they embraced was worth every risk Jakob had taken, every boundary he'd crossed, every moment of fear he'd endured during the search. "I knew you'd come back, Mommy," Lila said with the absolute confidence of childhood faith. "Mr. Jakob promised we'd find you, and Mr. Jakob always keeps his promises." But it was the moment when Rebecca knelt down to Lila's level and introduced herself as Jakob's daughter that truly completed the circle of healing that had begun with a frightened child's plea for help at the edge of a cornfield. "So we really are going to be a family," Lila said, looking back and forth between the three adults who had fought so hard to protect her and each other, just like in my picture. Jakob felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah's funeral, but these were tears of gratitude rather than grief. The isolation that had defined his life for 3 years was ending, replaced by relationships restored and new bonds formed through shared struggle and mutual sacrifice. The community celebration that followed their return was unlike anything Jakob had experienced in decades. Neighbors who had been victims of Richardson's fraud came to thank Rebecca for her work on their behalf. Families who had lost land to fraudulent claims learned that federal prosecutors were already working to restore their property rights. And Bishop Lapp, who had initially worried about Jakob's involvement with English complications, publicly praised his courage and commitment to justice. "Sometimes," the bishop said during a community meal held to honor the resolution of the crisis, "God calls us to step outside our familiar boundaries to accomplish his purposes." Jakob Stoltzfus reminded us all that faith without action is empty, and that protecting the vulnerable sometimes requires us to engage with a world that seems foreign to our experience. As evening settled over the farm that had become home to an unlikely family, Jakob sat on his front porch with Rebecca on one side and Lila on the other, watching Dr. Westbrook examine the rosebush that Sarah had planted years earlier. The child's drawing had indeed become prophetic. They were a family now, brought together by crisis, but sustained by love that had survived separation, misunderstanding, and the kind of evil that seeks to destroy rather than build. "Papa," Rebecca said quietly, "I want to come home, not to live the way I did before, but to find a way to combine the work I'm called to do with the community that shaped me. Dr. Westbrook and I are going to continue our legal practice, but we want to base it here, where we can serve families like ours while staying connected to the values that make such service meaningful." Jakob's smile was the first completely joyful expression his face had worn since Sarah's death. The prodigal daughter had indeed returned, but she brought with her new understanding of how faith could be lived in the modern world, and how traditional values could be preserved while still engaging with contemporary challenges. "Welcome home, daughter," he said simply. "All of you welcome home." The family photograph that Detective Santos took 6 months later captured a moment of quiet contentment that seemed to sum up all the healing that had taken place since that October morning when Jakob first found Lila at the edge of his cornfield. In the picture, Jakob sits on his front porch with Rebecca beside him, a legal briefcase set aside in favor of a quilting project she'd taken up under Sarah's old teacher, Mrs. Yoder. Lila perches on the porch steps between them, her blonde hair neatly braided in the Amish style she'd insisted on learning, while Dr. Emma Westbrook, now simply Emma to everyone in the community, tends the expanded garden that had become her passion since moving to the small house they built on the back 40 of Jakob's land. "It's hard to believe it's only been 6 months," Emma said, as she joined them on the porch after Detective Santos departed with promises to send copies of the photograph to everyone. "Sometimes it feels like we've been a family for years." "In some ways we have been," Rebecca replied, looking up from the wedding ring quilt pattern she was learning a design that Sarah had never finished, but that seemed appropriate for celebrating restored relationships. The bonds that brought us together were forming long before we actually met. The legal aftermath of Richardson Development Group's collapse had exceeded everyone's expectations. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions on racketeering charges that resulted in 20-year prison sentences for Richardson and his key associates. More than 200 families had received financial settlements and property restorations totaling nearly $300 million. And the legal aid practice that Rebecca and Emma had established in the converted barn had become a model for rural legal services, helping families throughout central Pennsylvania navigate complex property and inheritance issues. "Mr. Jakob," Lila said, settling against his side with the natural affection that had never wavered since their first meeting, "do you think Mama Sarah would be happy about how everything turned out?" The question had become a regular part of their evening conversations. Layla's way of including the grandmother she'd never met but whose influence permeated every aspect of their daily life. Jakob had learned to speak of Sarah naturally, sharing memories and wisdom rather than hiding behind grief, partly because Lila's innocent curiosity had made such openness feel safe and healing. "I think she'd be very proud of all of us," Jakob replied, his fingers unconsciously finding the wedding ring he still wore but now understood differently. She always believed that love was meant to grow and include new people, not shrink and exclude them. The community's acceptance of their unconventional family arrangement had surprised everyone, particularly Bishop Lapp, who had initially worried about the complications of English integration. But the practical benefits of having legal expertise readily available had proven invaluable, and Emma's academic background in historical research had helped several families resolve long-standing property disputes without litigation. "It's remarkable how naturally she's adapted," Bishop Lapp had observed during a recent visit, watching Emma help with the community's annual barn raising with the same enthusiasm she'd once brought to university lectures. "She approaches our customs with the same scholarly curiosity she applied to historical research, but without trying to change us or judge us." Emma had indeed found unexpected fulfillment in the rhythms of rural life, though she maintained her professional commitments through a combination of remote academic work and her partnership with Rebecca in their legal practice. Lila had thrived in the combination of cultures, attending the local public school while spending afternoons learning traditional skills from Amish neighbors, who delighted in teaching such an eager student. "I like being part of both worlds," Lila had explained to a reporter who'd visited to write about their unusual family. "Mommy teaches me about history and learning. Mr. Jakob teaches me about faith and kindness. And Rebecca teaches me about helping people solve their problems. I get to learn everything." The child's easy integration of different cultural influences had become a source of wonder to adults, who'd assumed such combinations were impossible. She moved seamlessly between helping Emma with academic research, assisting Jakob with farm chores, and working alongside Rebecca on legal cases that affected families like theirs. Her bilingual abilities, she'd mastered Pennsylvania Dutch with remarkable speed, made her an invaluable interpreter when cultural misunderstandings arose. As autumn returned to Pennsylvania and the anniversary of their first meeting approached, Jakob found himself reflecting on the profound changes that a single act of compassion had initiated. His careful isolation had been replaced by purposeful engagement. His grief-centered existence had evolved into a life focused on service and family restoration. Most remarkably, his rigid understanding of faith and community had expanded to encompass possibilities he'd never imagined. "Papa," Rebecca said, as they prepared for another evening of shared reading, a tradition that now included Emma's historical texts alongside scripture and Lila's endless supply of library books. "Want you to know that coming home didn't mean giving up my calling. It meant finding a way to live it more authentically." "I understand that now," Jakob replied, his voice carrying the peace that had replaced years of uncertainty about his daughter's choices. "Your mother always said that God's work takes many forms, and that our job is to be faithful to whatever form. He calls us to, not to judge the forms. He calls others to. Emma, overhearing their conversation as she helped Lila prepare for bed, added her own perspective with the gentle wisdom that had made her such a natural fit for their family. What I've learned living here is that community isn't about everyone being the same. It's about everyone being committed to each other's welfare, even when they're different. The photograph Detective Santos had taken would eventually find its way into newspaper articles about rural legal aid and academic studies of cultural integration. But for the family it depicted, its greatest value was as a record of healing, accomplished and promises kept. Jakob had indeed brought Rebecca home, though not in the way he'd originally imagined. Emma had found safety and belonging for herself and her daughter, though in a context she'd never anticipated. And Lila had gotten her wish for a restored family, though one that looked very different from what anyone might have predicted. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle around the Pennsylvania farm that had become home to such an unlikely collection of people, the lessons learned during those frightening October days continued to influence decisions both large and small. The importance of stepping outside familiar boundaries when love demands it. The value of maintaining hope even when circumstances seem impossible. The power of community support in times of crisis. And most importantly, the truth that families can be formed by choice and commitment just as surely as by blood and tradition. "Thank you," Lila whispered to Jakob as he tucked her into Rebecca's old bed, now permanently hers, but still containing the wooden cross that Sarah had carved decades earlier. "For keeping your promise to find Mommy, and for making us all into a real family." "Thank you," Jakob replied, his heart full of gratitude for the child whose desperate plea for help had saved them all from lives of incompleteness. "For reminding me what promises are worth keeping." Outside, the October night settled over the cornfield where their story had begun. But inside the farmhouse that had been transformed from a monument to loss into a celebration of restored love, 4 people who had found each other against impossible odds settled into sleep with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some miracles are worth waiting for, and that the best families are often the ones we choose to create rather than the ones we're simply born into.